start with a quick quiz question, a bit of trivia. Who am I? I was born in 1971 in the USA. At age 16, I began competing in triathlons. I became the national sprint course champion in 1989. In 92, I began my career as a professional cyclist. I won the world championship in 93. In 96, I was diagnosed with cancer. I recovered and returned to cycling in 98. I won the Tour de France that year, and for the next 7 years in a row, I am, you've probably guessed it, Lance Armstrong. Now, we love winners, particularly those who overcome adversity, but why is Lance Armstrong, one of the biggest winners and overcomers of all time, not loved by many people today? Well, because he cheated. He did the wrong thing. He took performance-enhancing drugs. So we love winners, but it seems that as human beings, we don't like cheaters. We don't like people who do the wrong thing. And so it makes us angry when we hear about cheating and corruption in business. Think of the Volkswagen emissions scandal, or in politics, think of ministers' expense scandals, or cash for access to politicians scandals, or in sports, think of match fixing scandals in cricket. Now, I won't say much more about that. As an Australian, that one really hits a bit too close to home. But when we think of examples like these, we think, wouldn't it be great if we could just somehow get rid of cheating and corruption and unethical behavior in society altogether? Wouldn't the world be a better place? Well, here's an interesting question. Why don't we? If we don't like cheating and corruption, why not just get rid of it altogether? Well, of course, the problem, as it turns out, is it's just not that easy. As the philosopher Dallas Willard put it, the human condition is one where we don't want to do what is bad, but we find it necessary. Have you ever noticed that? How doing the right thing, like telling the truth, for example, it's not always the easy thing, often in conflict with our happiness or our comfort. Once in a Sunday school class, a little girl was asked the question, what is a lie? And she said, it is an abomination to God and a very present help in times of trouble. Clearly, doing the right thing is not always the easy thing. So just consider the problem of cheating, whether it's in sport or business or politics. We tend to assume that cheating is just done by a few bad apples, right? And if we get rid of those bad apples, then most of the lying, cheating, and unethical behavior that takes place in the world would be dealt with. But unfortunately, all the research does not back up that instinct. In his book, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, New York Times best-selling book, Professor Dan Ariely, a professor in psychology and behavioral economics at Duke University, explains that most of the cheating that takes place in society is actually made up of lots and lots of different and subtle kinds of dishonest acts that almost everyone practices at some point or another. And together, these cumulative acts have a big effect. And he just cites case study after case study to illustrate this. Let me give you one example. In one case study, he talks about the mystery of a gift shop in Washington, D.C.'s Art Center that was found to be losing about $150,000 US a year. And as payments were made into a cash box rather than a register, the first assumption was that someone was stealing. However, after firing the person that they thought was doing the stealing, these losses just continued until eventually they discovered that the problem was not just one thief, but many well-meaning volunteers, each borrowing small amounts of money over the course of the year, but somehow never getting around to returning that money. According to Professor Ariely, all the research, case study after another, shows that the problem of cheating and unethical behavior in society is not just one of a few bad apples spoiling it for everyone else. The problem, says Professor Ariely, is that almost all of us take moral shortcuts. We all cheat. Ariely explains that at the heart of the issue is that as humans, we live with two opposing fundamental motivations. On the one hand, we want to see ourselves as good, honest, and upright people. And on the other hand, we desire to gain the benefits that could come from cheating. In other words, we want to be able to look ourselves in the mirror every morning and see a good person staring back at us, but we also want to do whatever will help us get ahead in life. So how do we handle these conflicting desires? We do so, Ariely says, through a process of rationalization. In essence, we lie to ourselves. We see this dynamic at work, for example, in a case study by psychologists that involved them placing a 6-pack of Coca-Cola and several $1 bills in a refrigerator in a student dormitory. Now, in both cases, the students knew that the money and the Coke belonged to someone else and were off limits. But what do you think happened? Well, the money remained untouched in the refrigerator, but every can of Coca-Cola was eventually stolen. Why? Well, because we all know that we shouldn't steal, and taking cash would be blatantly stealing, doing what our consciences tell us we shouldn't do. However, students were able to take a can of Coca-Cola and rationalize in their minds that it wasn't really stealing, even though those cans of Coke were, of course, purchased with what? Money. Professor Ariely calls this ability to deceive even ourselves cognitive flexibility. It allows us to get what we want through cheating, but still think of ourselves as good people. Now, the other thing about cheating and dishonesty that the research shows is that the more socially acceptable that cheating appears to be, the more likely we are to give in to cheating. For example, in another case study, these psychologists, they come up with all sorts of evil schemes to trick human beings into doing things just for books to publish on human behavior. But anyway, these psychologists had people take a maths test in which they would be rewarded a dollar, so this is in the US, for every correct answer, but they were permitted to mark their own paper, which of course gave them the opportunity to cheat. And of course, lots of people did cheat. But even more interestingly, in one of the rooms, they also placed a staged actor. And secretly, this person's acting, but they get up in front of the class and pretend to get 100% of the answers right, and in an impossibly short amount of time, and are rewarded for it in front of everyone. By witnessing a single person getting away with cheating so blatantly, what do you think happened? Well, participants in this class cheated double the amount than all the other classes, showing, as did many other experiments, that we human beings are incredibly vulnerable to the group environment. Once cheating or other unethical behavior starts, says Professor Ariely, it tends to gain momentum. It becomes contagious, which is why he suggests that institutions shouldn't tolerate even small indiscretions, because it just lowers the bar for everyone. In short, his research highlights just how morally fallible we all are, even those of us with good intentions, which thankfully is actually most of us. So then, how do we get rid of the problem of unethical behavior if virtually everyone is the problem? How do we, for example, get rid of the problem of cheating if all the research shows that virtually everyone does it in one way or the other, and it just adds up? Well, the usual answer that we're given as to why we should be ethical instead of unethical is that if everyone's unethical, we'll all be worse off. For example, in business, the answer to the question, why not cheat, is that it won't be profitable for the business because the business will lose people's trust, and it won't be profitable for the employee because they may be demoted or fired for cheating. But here's the thing. What if I discover as an individual within an institution that acting unethically would actually be better for me personally, even if not for the business? What if my personal bank account would actually be better off if I cheated a little bit? Or what if my personal career trajectory would actually sail that much higher if I lied a little bit? And what if I knew that I wouldn't get caught? What then is my motivation to act ethically? Now, this is a question that gets to the heart of everything, yet surprisingly, it's a question that ethics courses rarely seem to address, even though it's the most simple or basic question in morality. Why not cheat if you can get away with it and end up with everything you want? The ancient Greek philosopher Plato deals with this question in his famous book, The Republic. And in it, we find a very interesting dialogue between Plato's teacher, Socrates, and a man by the name of Thrasymachus. Now, Thrasymachus, apart from having somewhat of a cool name, is what we might call a radical moral skeptic. That means that, like many people today, Thrasymachus believes there is no objective moral law. And so he says to Socrates, now look, Socrates, don't be naive. There are no moral absolutes. The end justifies the means. Justice is just a mask for power. Ethics is just a bunch of rules that other people invent. It's not a real thing. So there's no reason why we shouldn't cheat if cheating helps us win. There's no reason why we shouldn't be unethical if being unethical helps us get what we want. And he then illustrates his point with reference to the ancient Greek myth of Gyges, a poor and lowly shepherd who hates being poor and lowly. And one day in the myth, in the story, Gyges the shepherd discovers something that's going to change his life, something that's going to make him a surefire winner by giving him the power to do whatever he wants and to know that he can get away with it because it gives him the power of invisibility. So what does Gyges do with this ring of power? Well, he uses it to kill the king, to marry the queen, to eventually rule the whole kingdom, all the while fooling everyone into believing that he's a really great person. And the argument that Thrasymachus puts to Socrates is, why not be unethical if, like Gyges the shepherd, you know you can get away with it and end up with everything you've ever wanted? It's actually a very difficult question to answer if you don't believe in an objective moral law like Thrasymachus, because who doesn't want to end up with everything they've ever thought would make them happy? And if you believe there are no moral absolutes and that ethics is just a bunch of rules that other people invent or other people have invented, why should we let those rules put any limits on our happiness? So in light of Thrasymachus's powerful challenge, it seems to me that if we really hope to find a cure or a solution to the problem of unethical behavior in society, which we've identified is not just down to a few bad apples, but to most of us, that at least two things are needed here. Firstly, a really good reason to be good. And secondly, genuine help to be good. Now, interestingly, the Christian claim is that both of these things can be found or uniquely converge in the person of Jesus Christ. So let's have a look at those two claims in turn. Firstly, a good reason to be good. Well, when ethics is taught today, most of the teaching is about how to be ethical, but not why. Often the most fundamental question is not even addressed, which is, where do these moral values that we all aspire to, like justice, courage, generosity, where do these moral values come from? Now, this might seem like a merely abstract question for the philosophers, but it's a really highly practical one. Now, let me try to illustrate the practicality of the issue with an example. So as an Australian, I have observed that one of the biggest moral issues facing people in Britain today is whether, when eating a scone, one should first spread on the jam, followed by the cream on top, or whether one should first put on the cream, followed by the jam. Now, I've discovered rather innocently that people in Britain can get very worked up about this, and each scone-eating camp believes that the other is clearly wrong. Now here's a different issue. Here's a serious issue. If I were to ask you whether racism is wrong, my guess is that you would say it is. I rarely meet anyone who says otherwise, but when we say racism is wrong, what do we mean by saying it's wrong? Do we mean it's wrong in the same way that 2 + 2 = 5 is wrong? Or do we mean it's wrong in the same way that jam first on a scone and then cream is wrong? Now, from where I sit as a Christian, when I say racism is wrong, I mean that it is wrong in the same way I mean 2 + 2 = 5 is wrong. I mean it's wrong in fact. Why? Well, because from where I sit, just as there are mathematical laws that we did not create as human beings, so too there are moral laws that we did not create as human beings. They exist independently of us, outside of us. If, however, I am, say, a secular humanist, someone who doesn't believe in God, but does believe in good moral values like justice and equality, then I believe that we don't discover morality, we create it, we choose it. In other words, we decide for ourselves if racism is wrong. But if that's the case, what if someone else decides for themselves that racism is not wrong? What if they decide for themselves that racism is actually good? If I'm a secular humanist, on what basis can I tell them that they're wrong? I cannot appeal to reason. Reason cannot decide here. There is no logical formula or syllogism that proves that racism is right or wrong, nor can I appeal to science. Science cannot decide here, for there is no scientific experiment that proves racism is right or wrong. As a secular humanist, it seems that I have no ground to stand on other than my own desire against racism, just as a racist has no ground to stand on other than their own desire for racism. And this is where things get tricky for secular humanism. For on the one hand, secular humanism says that Mr. Smith, to pick an example, must decide for himself what is good. But on the other, it wishes to say that Mr. Smith ought to respect all people. But if Mr. Smith says, well, I've decided for myself that people with different colored skin to me are not to be respected, what can the secular humanist say to Mr. Smith? They might want to say to Mr. Smith, you've made the wrong decision, because we ought to respect all people regardless of skin color. But they can't do that because the secular humanist believes that people have to decide for themselves what is good. So the secular humanist finds themselves conflicted, wanting to appeal to good moral values such as justice, equality, respect for human freedom, but without possessing a rational foundation or philosophical soil within which to root or ground the necessary universality of such values. The Oxford Don C.S. Lewis argued that for ethics to be really effective, it actually needs to operate on 3 levels, which he illustrates using a metaphor of a group of ships out at sea. Level 1, he says, is about making sure the ships don't bump into each other. He says this represents social ethics, rules about how to get along with each other. Level 2, he says, is about making sure that the ships themselves are seaworthy, that they can sail, that they can float, that they can steer. He says this is representative of character or virtue ethics. And lastly, he says level 3 is about the most fundamental question of them all, which is, why are the boats in the water in the first place? What's their mission? What's their purpose? Now, this is the most fundamental of questions, not just for every society, institution, or fleet of ships out at sea, but for every individual person as well. What's my purpose? Why am I here on this planet in the first place? Now, if you believe, as many do today, that we're all here as a result of, just a random combination of time plus matter plus chance, it makes it really rather difficult to point to any ultimate purpose in life, and therefore, on Lewis's view, any solid foundation for the ethical standards that we're all trying so hard to live up to. The philosopher Immanuel Kant observed that in order for the moral choice to be the rational choice, we must believe that living morally will eventually lead to our happiness in the end, because nobody wants to be unhappy in the end. But as Immanuel Kant also recognized, if there is no God, and if the universe is nothing more than a blind mechanical system, there is no guarantee that morality will end in happiness. There is no guarantee that cheaters will never prosper. The remarkable claim of Christianity, however, is that there is more to this life than unguided laws operating on mindless atoms. The Christian claim is that you and I are not here by accident at all, but here on purpose because somebody, God, wanted us to be here. Now, if this is true, then there are at least 2 profound implications that flow from this truth. Firstly, it means that there is an answer to the question, why am I here on this planet in the first place? Which for Christianity, the answer is to love and to be loved. Love of God and love of neighbor. And it also means that since there's an ultimate purpose in life, that there's a solid foundation for morality, for good and for evil. Goodness being that which is in alignment with our purpose, and evil being that which violates our purpose. And secondly, it means that when we do live in accordance with our purpose, that is when we love rather than hate, and heal rather than hurt, and lift others up rather than tear others down, when we do the thing we know is right, then we flourish as human beings, both inside and out, because we're living the life that we were made to live. It would mean that doing the right thing, even when it's not the easy thing, is worth it in the end. So that's crucial. Firstly, having a good reason to be good. However, I would argue that having a good reason to be good, though essential, is not sufficient, because as we've seen, we're all susceptible to the temptations of cheating or of taking a moral shortcut, even when we have the best of intentions. So on top of a reason to be good, I would argue we also need genuine help to be good. I don't know if you've ever heard of Andrew Carnegie. He was one of the world's wealthiest men in the early 20th century. And he was someone who tried to maintain his integrity. When he started out in business, he vowed to just give up the unbridled pursuit of making money at any cost in his 30s, so that he wouldn't get caught up in what he called the debasing idolatry of amassing power and wealth. And yet, when the time came to it, and he's in his 30s, and by then already incredibly wealthy, he was unwilling to leave the path of making money at any cost. And unfortunately, some of the character-degrading effects that he feared eventually worked themselves out in his life. Even though he became a great philanthropist, he built thousands of libraries. His employees said they would have much preferred if he just treated them with humane working conditions. It's been said that the working conditions and the long hours that Carnegie demanded from his factory workers in pursuit of more profit were so harsh, the housing so deplorable, that most of his workers died in their early 40s or earlier from accidents or disease. The most famous words of Jesus, perhaps, are, "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet lose their soul?" Now, to be fair, most people, thankfully, don't willfully sell their souls to the ring of power, like Gyges the shepherd, or like Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, whose character, you've probably guessed, was inspired by the myth of Gyges the shepherd. Most of us are actually trying to do the right thing most of the time. Yet most of us find ourselves, so most of us find ourselves falling, if we fall, not like Gollum, who actively embraces this ring of power, but like Frodo. You see, Frodo was a good hobbit, but bit by bit by bit, over time, the ring slowly got a hold of him. If you remember the movie or the books, fatigue, the pressures of responsibility, the suggestive whispers of Gollum, just the gradual weakening of his will, all these things conspired until eventually Frodo fails almost at the climax of the movie, the critical moment. He falls morally. He can't give up the ring of power. He won't. He gives himself over to it in the end. He throws the good aside, and in the end, it's only an unlikely act of divine providence that saves him and everyone else in Middle Earth. So how do we fight unethical behavior and corruption in society if, as Tolkien's rendition of Frodo and his story suggests, we can't even win the battle for goodness in our own lives? How do we deal with the problem out there if we're also dealing with the problem in here? That's the real challenge we face as human beings. If the human problem is the problem of the human heart, how do we heal ourselves? There's an old story about two pastors, two ministers, who were going to visit a man whose wife had left him because she had caught him cheating on her. And as they were on their way to counsel him, the older minister said to the younger minister, "Do you think you could ever do something like this?" And the younger pastor said, "No, there's no way I could ever do something so despicable as that man has done." And the old pastor said, "Well, you better go home then. I'll take care of this one alone." Human experience, as well as modern psychology, shows us that we are so morally fallible as human beings. Even the most well-intentioned of us can fall. And the less we realize this, the more susceptible to falling we are. Interestingly, we see this dynamic at work in the lives of the many revered men and women recorded in the Bible. All the well-known characters, Adam, Eve, Abraham, Sarah, Moses, Miriam, David, Peter, just to name a few, they all fail morally and often in big ways. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people unfamiliar with the Bible. There's a perception that Christianity is all about being a good person, like a club for people who think that they are holier than everyone else. But according to the Bible, being a Christian is not primarily about being a good person. It's primarily about being in a relationship with a person who is good, perfectly good. But this perfectly good God does not say to us, you also must be perfectly good, or else. The Christian story is that through Jesus, all are invited, as good or as bad as we are, into relationship with him if we want it. This message that we don't have to be good enough to be accepted by God is what Christians traditionally call the gospel, which means good news. And the word that they use to describe God's dealing with us this way is grace. Grace means getting what you don't deserve in a good way. And we see this grace, for example, in a story recorded in the Bible about an encounter between Jesus and a man named Zacchaeus. Now, interestingly, the name Zacchaeus means in Hebrew, righteous one, indicating that Zacchaeus was probably from a religious family, but Zacchaeus was anything but righteous. Rather than growing up to be a good Jewish boy, as his mother might have hoped, Zacchaeus had chosen to be part of this great machine that was at that point in history oppressing the Jewish people. He'd become a tax collector for the Roman Empire, a chief tax collector, no less, collecting money from his own Jewish people to give to the Roman oppressors, while at the same time taking a corrupt slice of that money for himself on the side. And thanks to this unethical behavior, Zacchaeus had become a very wealthy man, pretty much achieved everything he'd wanted. He had lots of people working for him. But for some reason, something about this peripatetic teacher named Jesus had captured Zacchaeus' attention. So much so that, as the Bible recounts, Zacchaeus went to extraordinary lengths just to catch a glimpse of Jesus. So Zacchaeus is a short man, and he wasn't able to see over the crowd that normally gathered when Jesus was coming into a village. So Zacchaeus unceremoniously climbs up to the top of a sycamore tree to get a good view of Jesus as he passes by. But Jesus doesn't pass by. He stops. He looks up at Zacchaeus and he says, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Now, to the moralists and the religious legalists of this village, that would have been an outrage, because Zacchaeus was a cheat. He was a swindler. He was a traitor to his own people. He was a moral failure. Jesus shouldn't have spoken to him, let alone invited himself to Zacchaeus' house. Zacchaeus deserved nothing but social alienation and rejection. Zacchaeus himself, however, was delighted by the invitation. And not only did Zacchaeus receive Jesus into his home, it appears he received him into his heart as well, because the impact of this encounter with Jesus was a total transformation of Zacchaeus' attitude. He vowed to give half of his possessions to the poor and to pay back those that he had cheated 4 times the amount. And so we read in the narrative that in meeting Jesus and encountering his love, Zacchaeus' selfish soul was somehow healed, or somehow on the road to healing, because no longer was he oriented towards the question, how much can I get? How much can I get? But how much can I give? And so we read that Jesus says to him, today, salvation has come to this house. And what's fascinating about that is that salvation in religious terms is almost always something that you earn, something that you work towards by good works and good deeds and religious practices. But what is crystal clear from the story is that Zacchaeus did not deserve salvation. His life did not merit God's love. Nonetheless, he received it as a gift of grace when he opened his heart to Jesus. So we might say then that Zacchaeus the tax collector discovered in the person of Jesus Christ these two things that we've been talking about and that are going to provide the foundation of our time of discussion. One, a good reason to be good, and two, genuine help to be good. Now, while we may never have cheated in life as spectacularly as Zacchaeus ever did, or maybe we have, but whichever the case, are not all of us in need of these two things as well if we're wanting to do the right thing, even when it's not the easy thing? A really good reason to be good and help to be good. Whoever we are, it's vital that we discover these things in our lives for ourselves. Thank you.